If you love great stories, you've come to the right place. Subscribe to my channel to make sure you don't miss any new videos. Like and share this video with your friends if you enjoyed it, and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. The Great Keep of Winterfell was no longer a home. It was a chimney for the cold. Above ground, the world was a cacophony of sapphire blue explosions and the wet, tearing sounds of Viserion's necrotic fire. But beneath the stone, in the ancient crypts, the silence was so heavy it felt like it had weight. Jon Snow stood at the entrance to the lower levels, his torch flickering in a draft that shouldn't have existed. Beside him, Sansa and Arya were organizing the survivors, thousands of women, children, and wounded soldiers huddled in the dark, surrounded by the stone effigies of the kings of winter. "The air is changing," Arya whispered, her hand tight on the hilt of needle. "It doesn't smell like old dust anymore. It smells like ozone, like the sky before a wildfire strike." Jon nodded, his face grim. "Cersei's cobalt burn is leaking through the foundations. The sapphire fire doesn't just burn wood, Arya. It eats the heat out of the stone. If the foundations freeze too fast, the whole castle will collapse into these crypts." The terror in the crypts was not just coming from the ceiling. Among the survivors were several Lannister scouts who had fled the massacre at Fort Lionheart. They had been welcomed in the desperation of the retreat, but they carried a secret they didn't even know they possessed. One of the soldiers, a young man with a gilded lion pinned to his tattered cloak, began to cough. It wasn't a normal cough. It was a wet, metallic sound. As he pulled his hand away from his mouth, his palm was covered in a fine, emerald-green dust. "The fever," Tyrion Lannister whispered, appearing from the shadows of a Stark tomb. He walked toward the soldier, his eyes wide with a realization that turned his stomach. "It's not just in the wine anymore, Jon. The cobalt burn, the sapphire wildfire Cersei used on the wall, it's aerosolized. It's in the smoke. Anyone who breathed the blue fire is carrying the seed of the silence." The soldier's eyes began to glaze over. He didn't turn into a white. He didn't die. He simply sat down and stopped moving, his skin beginning to take on the translucent, crystalline sheen of the gilded fever. He was becoming a statue of living glass. "She's turned the air into a weapon," Sansa said, her voice trembling. "Even if we win the battle, we've already breathed in our own deaths. This is the scourge she promised, a winter that stays inside your lungs." As the sapphire fire above ground continued to destabilize the magic of the north, something shifted in the deepest levels of the crypts. The Night King's presence was like a key turning in a lock that hadn't been touched in thousands of years. Jon heard it first, a low, grinding sound of stone against stone. It wasn't the sound of enemies breaking in. It was the sound of something breaking out. "The tombs," Jon breathed. He ran toward the statues of the ancient Starks. For centuries, the lords of Winterfell had been buried with iron swords across their laps to keep their spirits from wandering. But the iron had rusted, and the sapphire wildfire leaking from above had turned the iron brittle. With a sound like a thunderclap, the stone lid of Cregan Stark's tomb shattered. A hand, skeletal and wrapped in rotted fur, reached out. But the eyes that snapped open were not the sapphire blue of the Night King. They were a dull, flickering orange, the color of a dying ember. "They aren't his," Arya said, her eyes wide. "They aren't whites." The magic of the crypts, Jon realized. The old spells, they're reacting to the wildfire. The ancestors aren't rising to join the Night King, they're rising to defend the home. But they're broken, Arya. They're corrupted by the gilded poison. The ancient Starks rose from their graves, but they were horrors of half-ice and half-emerald fire. They were the ancestors of the Ash, creatures born of northern magic and southern alchemy. They began to move through the crypts, their movements jerky and violent. They didn't recognize the living. To them, anything that moved was a violation of the silence. The crypts turned from a sanctuary into a slaughterhouse. The ancestors of the Ash fell upon the survivors. A Stark king from 300 years ago, his ribs glowing with a faint green light, swung a rusted mace into a group of Lannister refugees. Jon drew Longclaw, the Valyrian steel the only thing that could slice through the magically hardened bone of his own ancestors. Defend the children. Get them to the lower tunnels. It was a nightmare of family killing family. Jon was forced to strike down the image of his own history to save the future. Every time Longclaw struck an ancient Stark, a cloud of emerald dust erupted, making the air even more toxic. "We're trapped," Sansa shouted, as the entrance to the surface was buried under a fall of sapphire-chilled stone. "We're being buried alive with our own dead." In the chaos, Bran Stark sat in his chair, his eyes rolled back into his head. He wasn't in the crypts. He was in the green site, but the green was no longer the color of the forest. It was the color of Cersei's wildfire. He saw the Night King standing over the heart tree in the Godswood. The Night King wasn't attacking. He was touching the white bark of the weirwood. As his hand met the tree, the red leaves turned black, and the sap began to flow green. "The connection," Bran's voice whispered through the crypts, projected by his power. "The Night King is using the weirwood network to broadcast the Gilded Fever. He isn't just killing the North, he's rewriting the memory of the Earth. He is merging the frost with the fire." Jon, covered in the dust of his ancestors, looked up at the ceiling. He could feel the weight of the Night King above him, and the weight of Cersei's greed all around him. "If he takes the weirwood," Jon shouted over the screams, "there won't be a world left to save. Not even the stories will survive." Jon realized that they couldn't stay in the crypts. They were being consumed by the scourge of winter from the inside out. "Arya, take the survivors through the secret passages to the Wolfswood," Jon commanded. "Sansa, go with them. You are the Lady of Winterfell. If the castle falls, the North lives in you." "And you?" Sansa asked. "I'm going up," Jon said, his face illuminated by the flickering emerald light of a dying ancestor. "I'm going to find the Night King, and I'm going to show him that even a broken world has enough fire left to bite." Jon Snow, climbing the crumbling stones, stares toward the surface. Behind him, the crypts are a hellscape of green shadows and skeletal kings. Above him, the sky is a roaring vortex of sapphire wildfire. The scourge of winter had arrived in full, and as Jon emerged into the snowy courtyard, he found himself standing in a world that was no longer white or black. It was a shimmering, deadly emerald. Jon Snow emerged from the crypts like a ghost rising from the earth. The air above was no longer air. It was a pressurized mist of frost and pulverized stone. The courtyard of Winterfell was a landscape of frozen carnage. The dead Lannister soldiers, their gilded armor now glowing with a faint, bioluminescent sapphire light, stood in silent rows, waiting for the command of their new master. The sapphire wildfire, the cobalt burn, had done its work. The great keep was encased in a layer of crystalline ice, so thick it looked like a massive, jagged sapphire reflecting the dying moon. "Jon." He turned to see Daenerys landing regal near the broken gatehouse. The green dragon was shivering, his scales covered in a rime of frost that crackled every time he moved. Daenerys climbed down, her white furs stained with the black blood of the dead and the green soot of the south. "The weirwood," she gasped, pointing toward the Godswood. "The Night King isn't just killing us, Jon. He's drinking the tree." They ran toward the Godswood, the only part of Winterfell that hadn't been touched by the sapphire fire. But as they crossed the threshold, the world changed. The red leaves of the heart tree were no longer red. They were a translucent, crystalline green. The sap that wept from the carved face on the trunk was the thick, glowing emerald of Cersei's wildfire. The Night King stood at the base of the tree. He wasn't holding a blade. He was holding the bark. His touch was turning the ancient network of the weirwoods, the memory of all life in Westeros, into a conduit for the gilded poison. "He's merging them," Jon whispered, his breath hitching. "He's taking the memory of the Starks and the fire of the Lannisters. He doesn't want to destroy the world anymore, Dany. He wants to become the world. A world that never changes, never grows, and never breathes. An eternal gilded silence." The Night King turned. His face, once the color of a winter sky, now had delicate veins of emerald light pulsing beneath the ice of his skin. He had evolved. He was no longer just the scourge of winter. He was the scourge of the age. Jon drew Longclaw, and Daenerys raised a dragon glass-tipped spear. They moved as one, the dragon and the direwolf, charging the center of the world. The Night King didn't summon his whites. He drew a blade that sent a chill through the forest, a sword made not of ice, but of a strange, glass-like substance that shimmered with both blue and green light. It was a blade of gilded ice, forged in the heat of the sapphire wildfire. The clash of the blades sounded like the world breaking. When Longclaw met the Night King's sword, a wave of cold energy threw Jon back 10 paces. The ground where he landed shattered like glass. Daenerys lunged, her spear aimed at the Night King's chest, but he moved with a fluid, terrifying speed. He caught the spear midair, the wood instantly turning to ice and crumbling in his grip. With a backhand strike, he sent Daenerys flying into the roots of the heart tree. "You think fire can stop the frost?" The Night King's voice didn't speak, but it echoed in their minds, a sound like grinding glaciers. "You think the lioness's greed was a weapon against me? It was an invitation. She provided the fuel, I provided the eternity." Jon scrambled to his feet, his muscles screaming. He noticed something horrific. Every time he struck the Night King, the gilded fever, the emerald crystals, would heal the ice almost instantly. Cersei's wildfire, meant to destroy, was acting as a regenerative catalyst for the Night King's magic. The alchemy of the South had granted the King of the North a form of immortality that even Valyrian steel couldn't pierce. "He's a closed loop, Jon." Bran's voice suddenly cut through the air, emanating from the heart tree itself. The carved face on the tree began to speak, its wooden eyes weeping green fire. "You can't kill him with fire or steel. He is the debt that can't be paid. To stop him, you have to break the connection to the source." "The source," Jon shouted, parrying another strike that sent shards of ice into his shoulder. "The gold," Bran cried. "The Lannister gold in the vaults of the South. It's the anchor. Cersei's hoard is acting as the battery for his power. As long as the Gilded Throne exists, he cannot fall." Jon realized the magnitude of the tragedy. They were fighting a war in the north that could only be won in the south, but they didn't have time to sail to King's Landing. The Night King was seconds away from completing the corruption of the weirwood. "Dany," Jon yelled. "The tree, we have to burn it, all of it." "The weirwood," Daenerys looked at the ancient tree in horror. "If we burn it, the memory of the north dies, the old gods, everything we are. If we don't, the Night King uses it to kill every living soul from here to Dorne." Jon parried a blow that shattered his bracer. "Burn it, Dany, Dracarys." Daenerys looked at the heart tree, then at Jon, and finally at the Night King, who was reaching for Jon's throat with a hand made of emerald ice. She let out a scream of pure, agonizing grief. "Regal, Dracrys." The green dragon, perched on the walls of the godswood, unleashed a torrent of orange-gold fire. But as the flame hit the weirwood, it didn't just burn. Because the tree was full of Cersei's wildfire sap, it exploded in a pillar of blinding, emerald-orange light. The explosion was tectonic. The weirwood, the oldest living thing in the world, became a torch that reached the clouds. The Night King, who was physically connected to the roots, let out a sound, a high-pitched, metallic scream that shattered every window in Winterfell. The emerald light from the tree began to feed back into him, overwhelming his icy form. He wasn't melting, he was overloading. The gilded fever on his skin grew brighter and brighter until it was painful to look at. The feedback loop traveled through the ground, through the snow, and across the continent. In King's Landing, miles away, Cersei Lannister felt a sudden, sharp pain in her chest as the gold in her vaults began to glow with a ghost light. For a moment, the Night King stood frozen in the center of the emerald inferno. He looked at Jon, and for the first time, his blue eyes showed something other than cold indifference. They showed recognition. He was a man once, and in the fire of the weirwood, he remembered the weight of the sun. Then he shattered. He didn't die like a man. He exploded into a million shards of diamond-hard ice and green glass. The shockwave leveled the remaining trees in the godswood and threw Jon and Daenerys into the deep snow. The silence that followed was absolute. The army of the dead in the courtyard simply stopped. They didn't shatter, they just became corpses again, falling where they stood like puppets with their strings cut. The Lannister whites slumped into their gilded armor, their sapphire eyes fading to black. Jon crawled through the hot ash toward the spot where the heart tree had been. There was nothing left but a smoking hole in the earth. The memory of the North was gone. The old gods were dead. He found Daenerys near the roots. She was alive, but her face was scorched, and her eyes were empty. They had won the battle, but the scourge of winter had taken the soul of the land. "We did it," Jon whispered, his voice a ghost. "No," Daenerys said, looking at the blackened earth. "We didn't win, Jon. We just cleared the path for the lioness. The dead are gone, but the fire is still coming. The castle is a ruin of black stone and sapphire ice. The Night King is gone, but the sky to the south is glowing with a faint, ominous green. Cersei Lannister was still on her throne, and now there was nothing left in the north to stop her from claiming the graveyard she had created." The morning after the long night did not bring a golden sun. Instead, a gray, sickly dawn filtered through a sky choked with the incinerated remains of the weirwood. The godswood, once a cathedral of red and white, was now a charcoal pit. The ground still hissed where the emerald sap had boiled away, leaving behind a crust of salt and glass that shimmered like a dead man's eyes. Jon Snow stood in the center of the ruins, his hands blackened and raw. He was looking at the spot where the Night King had shattered. There was no body, only a pile of diamond-sharp shards and a single, twisted piece of Lannister gold that had been fused into the ice of the king's crown. "He was just a mirror, wasn't he?" Jon whispered. Daenerys stood behind him, her silver hair matted with soot. She looked at the blackened stumps of the trees. "A mirror for what, Jon?" "For us," Jon said, turning to her. "For the South, for Cersei. He took the cold of the world and met it with the greed of the living. We didn't just fight a monster, we fought a reflection of everything we've become." As the survivors emerged from the crypts, the full scale of the scourge became apparent. The victory over the Night King had come too late for many. In the courtyard, thousands of Northmen and Lannister refugees had been transformed into living statues. The aerosolized sapphire wildfire, the cobalt burn had frozen their blood mid-stride. They weren't dead in the traditional sense. Their hearts had simply ceased to beat, their bodies preserved in a translucent, emerald-tinted ice. Sansa Stark walked among them, her face a mask of grief. She reached out to touch the shoulder of a young northern boy. The moment her fingers met the ice, a faint, green light pulsed within the boy's chest. "He's still in there," Sansa gasped, pulling her hand back. "They're all still in there, Jon. They're trapped in the moment the fire met the frost." "It's the silence," Tyrion said, appearing from the shadows of the gatehouse. He was holding a ledger he had scavenged from the Lannister camp. "Qyburn's notes! He called it the perpetual debt. The wildfire doesn't just destroy, it preserves the agony. As long as the gold in the south continues to burn, these people will never truly die, and they will never be free." In the center of the courtyard, the shards of the Night King began to vibrate. It wasn't the magic of the dead returning, it was a resonance. Bran Stark, carried by a silent Samwell Tarly, was brought into the light. His eyes were no longer white, but they were clouded, as if he were looking at a world that no longer had a shape. "The Night King left a voice," Bran said, his voice sounding like dry leaves. "But it isn't his voice, it's the voice of the gold." As Bran spoke, the shards of ice on the ground began to arrange themselves, forming a jagged, crystalline map of Westeros. The map glowed with a rhythmic emerald pulse, a heartbeat that mirrored the one Jon had felt in the weirwood. The pulse was coming from the south, specifically from the Red Keep. "She's calling the fire home," Bran whispered. "Cersei has realized that the Night King is gone. She knows the north is broken. She is activating the final cache, the mother lode beneath the city. She doesn't want to rule the world anymore. She wants to be the only thing left in it." Daenerys looked at Rhaegal, who sat atop the broken battlements. The green dragon was breathing in heavy, ragged gasps. One of his wings was scorched by the sapphire fire, and his eyes were clouded with the gilded fever. "We can't wait for the thaw," Daenerys said, her voice regaining its iron. If we stay here, we die with the North. If we march, we die on the road. The only path is through the sky. Drogon is too wounded to carry a rider for long, Jon reminded her. And Regal is dying of the poison. Then we die in the air, Daenerys shouted, her grief finally turning into a terrifying, white-hot resolve. I did not walk through the fire to be buried in a Lannister's ice. We go to King's Landing. We take whatever is left of our strength and we burn the gold until it turns to lead. The order was given. The survivors of Winterfell, a ragtag army of Northmen, wildlings, and the few Lannister soldiers who hadn't turned to ice prepared to march. They were an army of ghosts. They carried no banners. They had no songs. As they marched out of the gates, they passed the living statues of their friends and family. It was a silent, horrific guard of honor. Jon Snow looked back at Winterfell one last time. The great keep was a jagged shard of black stone against a gray sky. The home of his ancestors was now a monument to the failure of the world. The North remembers, Jon whispered, but the words felt empty. The North was gone. There was only the road and the fire at the end of it. The scene shifts to King's Landing. Cersei Lannister is sitting on the Iron Throne. She is wearing a dress made of interlocking gold plates that look like dragon scales. She is holding a goblet of wine, but she isn't drinking. She is staring into the liquid. In the reflection of the wine, she sees the green glow of the wildfire caches beneath her feet. She feels the heartbeat of the North's destruction vibrating through the floorboards. They are coming, Your Grace, Qyburn whispered from the shadows. The dragon and the wolf, they have survived the frost. Cersei let out a soft, beautiful laugh. It was the sound of a woman who had finally found the end of a long, boring story. Let them come, Cersei said. They survived the Night King's silence. Now let them see if they can survive mine. She looked up at the ceiling of the great hall. The frescoes of the gods had been painted over with a single, massive image, a golden lion with eyes of emerald fire. The episode ends with a wide shot of the King's Road. Below, a line of gray figures moves south through a blizzard. Above, a single, wounded dragon flies through the ash, its roar a lonely. Desperate sound in a world that has stopped listening. The sound of the wildfire caches in the south, counting down to the final, gilded end. Thanks for watching this episode. Like, share, and follow for more interesting stories and narrations. Thanks a lot.